Fox News alert, Islamic forces seizing Syria's capital of Damascus, ending more than 50 years of the Assad family's dictatorship. Our next guests know all about fighting the war against extremism, a risk now of what could take over a different form of extremism in Syria. These men helped where the U.S. government failed Americans in Afghanistan. They helped get American citizens and our allies out of Afghanistan. So they know something about this type of chaos and the role of leadership America can play. Let's turn now to a panel of guests that includes Chad Robichaux, retired Marine, Mark Geist, also retired Marine, and Scott Mann, former Lieutenant Colonel, Green Beret, Special Forces, Army. Gentlemen, honored to have you with us this morning. I think this story and the role that a new Trump administration could play, along with incoming DOD Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, tied together. Chad, I'd love to start with you. What do you see, looking backwards at what you experienced, what you saw about Afghanistan, now what's happening in Syria, and the role that a Trump, Hegseth, and others led foreign policy could mean for America?
I mean, we've seen it the last 4 years, what we all have said. A strong America makes a stable world. A weak America, a weak White House, a weak Secretary of Defense makes a chaotic world, and that's what we have seen and witnessed. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth would be a phenomenal choice for several reasons. One is that he comes outside of the institution. Our most vulnerable part of American national security right now is not our military strategic capability. It's the fact that we have lowest morale, recruiting, and retention in 30 years. Those are three areas that I believe that need to be rectified. It has to come from someone outside the institution. Those are three areas that Pete Hegseth has addressed and has shown a passion in as a patriot, as a service member, and as someone who has a vision of leadership to lead our military direction.
Well, let's stay on that for just a moment before we turn back to Syria. Mark, I'll go to you on this. There's a new article out. It includes men that were involved in the helping, as all three of you were at various levels and together, I think, as well in some situations, people out of Afghanistan, after Afghanistan. And dozens of men like yourself have now signed on to a letter, I believe it's published in the Washington Examiner, that anybody wants to see, that says Pete Hegseth is right for DOD, Mark.
Yeah, he is. I think, he's probably got more recent experience on the battlefield, closer to the troops, understands what the war fighter on the ground is feeling, needs, and what is best for the country. As Chad said, I mean, we've got to address the issues of retention, of recruiting, and we have the greatest fighting force in the world, and typically, why are you going to do the same thing over and over? And with that fighting force, what limits us is if we're predictable or we're not willing to use it when necessary, but not being willy-nilly about how we use it as well.
Oh, and that last point's important, Mark. It is. And by the way, Scott, before I turn to you, I would love to just do a quick panel poll question here, because for all the talk about controversy or scandal and all the focus on these things with Hegseth, what matters is, does he the man to do the job? And I would just be curious, because all three of you have been and are in touch with the warfighter on the ground, active and retired. So I'm just going to go quick. So let's start with Chad and come back around, because I want to end talking to Scott about something else here. But Chad, do the warfighters support Hegseth?
Absolutely. I've never seen a groundswell of support in my 30 years around the military like I'm seeing right now for Pete Hegseth as SecDef.
And Mark, you as well, as you take your pulse of the guys you served with, does he have support among the rank and file?
Yeah, he does. I think it's it's very broad in who supports him, and I think he's going to be a great leader.
All right, Scott, let's go to the Special Forces community. Do they support Hegseth?
Yeah, I've been reaching out to a lot of Green Berets, Will, and a ton of support from the Special Forces Green Beret community on Pete. Absolutely.
So let's pick that up now. Scott, you and I have had a lot of conversations, and I know this is something that's passionate to you, but where we focus our attentions. It's now, you have expressed to me, I think on and off air, your concerns about attentions focusing away from the type of war you three gentlemen fought in that region. And now we're seeing it metastasize in Syria. So when you see this, bring together for me this new leadership under Trump and Hegseth.
Yeah, I mean, we may be done, and Chad and Mark said it brilliantly. We may be done with the war on terror, but it's not done with us. You know, the enemy has a vote in how they operate and what they're doing in Syria. Look for expansion of the ultimately of the Al-Qaeda caliphate under these different surrogate groups. And Pete understands that. In fact, you know, Will, this wasn't in the New York article, but, you know, I was in Concerned Veterans for America, and I was brought in there as a speaker with a handful of leaders who are combat veterans to talk about the role American civilians need to play in supporting our military in the war. And they tried to muzzle us. You know, they tried to get us to stop talking about that and talk about pulling back from these wars. And as a veteran, I wasn't good with that. And Pete said, you know what, keep going, man. Keep talking about this. And I did. He left shortly thereafter. And I was right out the door with him as a result of that. And that has not been talked about at all. This is a guy who has stood up for the warfighter through the Afghanistan abandonment. He was working the phones behind the scenes. He was helping his own interpreter get out, connecting. And the role that he's played with the warfighter at a grassroots level is something that I hope these senators will consider. And I hope that they'll listen to what the warfighters of the longest war in our nation's history are saying, which is we need reform and change immediately.
Well, I hope you're exactly right. I hope senators are listening to. I've got 3 warfighters here, but I can tell you from my personal experience as well, these 3 men represent a whole huge, vast community of warfighters to support Hegseth. And I'm just going to button one thing you said, Scott. Isn't it fascinating that you worked at CVA, Concerned Veterans for America? They're talking about a scandal and never talked to you. They talk for Vets for Freedom, but they never turned to Medal of Honor winner David Bellavia, who hired Pete to come to that institution. They talk about anonymous sources about his drinking, but they don't call Rachel Campos Duffy or Will Kane, who sat next to him for 5 years. It is really fascinating. They don't go to direct sources who have something to say. They instead lean on anonymous sources. I think you can see the quality of reporting laid out for you right there. But most importantly is what you guys have told us about today, the opinion of the warfighters on what's needed at DOT. I really appreciate you guys, Chad, Mark, and Scott, for laying that out for us this morning.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
All right, flu season is here, and we have a few tips.